Okay, good evening. I'm David Levine. I'm co-chairman of Science Writers in New York. I'm here with Ivan Oransky, who's vice president editorial at Medscape and distinguished writer in residence at the New York University's Carter Journalism Institute, where he teaches medical journalism. He's also president of the Association of Healthcare Journalists, which I'm a member of. He's co-founder of Retraction Watch, a blog that reports on retractions of scientific reports. In the past, Ivan was vice president and global editorial director of MedPage Today, executive editor of Reuters Health, managing editor online of Scientific American, and deputy editor of The Scientist. He has his medical degree from New York University, where he's clinical assistant professor of medicine. So Ivan, welcome. Thanks for coming in. Ivan's in Massachusetts. It's not a fake background like you see and many people have. I have a fake Hawaii background, but my head kind of melts into it. So anyway, since you're involved with Retraction Watch, let's talk about the retraction of the hydrochloroquine papers in New England Journal of Medicine and the Lancet, I think.
Lancet, yeah, sure. And happy to be here, David. And I'm sorry I'm not with the rest of you in New York, but being in Western Massachusetts is a pretty good thing to be right now. And you may hear some birds chirping and all sorts of things. But so there were two retractions that were related. Actually, only one had to do with hydroxychloroquine. That was in the Lancet. And then the other one, which was the same day, was in New England Journal of Medicine. What related them was not hydroxychloroquine, was actually the source of the data, or at least the apparent source of the data, the claimed source of the data. It was a company called Surgisphere, which no one had ever heard of until these papers were published. And the first paper was only published on May 1st in New England Journal. And they claimed to have, tens of millions, really. They were only drawing on tens of thousands of patient data points from around the world. And it's not quite clear what data they have. It's not quite clear where they came from. They won't produce them, which is really what led to the retractions after a lot of scientists raised some really serious questions about the data. But these are good examples of things that frankly are happening all the time. But because it's about COVID, and because in particular it's about hydroxychloroquine, which of course is a long time used drug for lupus and malaria, but has suddenly become, a sort of hot drug that frankly there is no evidence that it works for COVID, but everyone is starting to talk about it, including President Trump saying that it worked for COVID-19. Doesn't seem to be true. And so this captured a lot of attention. And, frankly, this has been going on for a while in terms of people calling me and reporters in particular calling me and asking questions and wanting to know more about retractions and about issues in science. But since the Lancet retraction, I think I do at least one interview a day, sometimes two, which is great. I'm happy to do it. But there's just a lot more interest in the last couple of weeks in these issues.
Okay, so, our topic is that, in the rush to get people information, are we losing faith in not only, scientists, but politicians and journalists? And so, at first we were told not to wear masks and to save them for our first responders. Now we're told we have to wear masks. First we were told not to wear gloves, then we said wear gloves. Now we're told maybe not so much wear gloves and just wash your hands, and there's also been talks about, this drug may work, it might not work. There's, a vaccine may be in phase 3 trials by July. That's what we learned yesterday. And there are like 20 vaccines in development. And so how does the public make sense of all this? Because it sounds hopeful. I mean, then there's a dexamethasone, which is supposed to help people. And I think that was like last week. And no one seems to be disputing that. But it's like, it's very, very rapid. And people are saying, I don't want to talk about the politics of, wearing a mask or not, but we don't really have one clear voice on this that's allowed anyways. And as a journalist, how do you cover this? I mean, because people want to know the latest news. And do you think it's hurting? Well, will there be lots more retractions or, I mean, the antibody tests also people say, well, they're not so good as you think they are. They're false positives, false negatives. So to you.
Well, I think, there's no question science is moving quickly. I think I would be the first to say we want science to move quickly. We want it to make as few mistakes as possible. There will be mistakes. There are mistakes when there isn't a pandemic, and yet we're all in the midst of this existential crisis. But, I don't want a vaccine quickly, like everyone does. I want to be able to, go out and sort of go back to at least some part of my, life before. So I feel as much as anyone. The problem is when we start to treat every tiny shred of information as, the final word, or as something that we should change our lives around or make different decisions around. But again, this isn't really new. We in health and medical reporting, we have sort of study of the week where one week coffee is great for you, and the next week it gives you diabetes, and red wine and chocolate, all those things. And everyone sort of, I think, thankfully, a lot of people laugh at that and sort of think, well, who cares? It's chocolate and red wine. But there is some whiplash there, and we've sort of normalized that covering every study as if it's critically important to such an extent that that's now what's happening. And in fact, people who've never covered studies before are covering every study as if it was critically important. We're covering this like a horse race. We're covering it like, when I say horse race, I'm really talking about the way that politics is covered, and every poll is somehow, we're going to change the world because of a poll. Well, no, you want to look at things over time. And the question is, do we have the luxury of time? And I still think we have the luxury of time if we want to get things right. And if we want to, actually have people trust, whether it's scientists, whether it's journalists, whether it's policymakers. And so what you need to do is think about, again, the first study that shows something. I never go out and buy the first, I'm an Android user, but I never go out and buy the first, new Android phone that somebody makes. If I were an iPhone user, I wouldn't buy the first sort of new iPhone either. I like the kinks to get worked out, and maybe even by somebody else, or by a lot of people, or by the company. And so I think we need to treat, every study as, let's give this a little bit of time. And the other thing that's happening, of course, is that really hasn't happened until this point, is that preprint servers, which I imagine a lot of, people tuning in today know about. I mean, this is, SWINY, and it's a lot of science reporters, science writers, etc.
Some people don't. It's open to the public.
For those who don't know what a preprint server is, these are, essentially, websites, servers where scientists can post papers without going through peer review. In fact, that's the whole point, is to get them out there more quickly. Now, I happen to think that's a really good thing. I think that getting information out more quickly so that other scientists and, frankly, journalists and everybody else can access it. What I don't think is so good is that we treat each one of these as if, again, it had been through some rigorous process where it was vetted. Now, I don't think that peer review, we started the conversation with New England Journal of Medicine and The Lancet, two of the world's top medical journals. These are peer-reviewed journals. I don't think that peer review is the perfect vetting system that a lot of journals and a lot of people would like us to think it is either. But if it's only been on a preprint server, then it definitely hasn't been peer-reviewed. It hasn't been vetted. These preprint servers that we're talking about, the two that, preprint servers have been around for a while. They've been around for close to 30 years in, physics and computer science and math. The two that are relevant today in terms of coronavirus are bioRxiv, which is about life science research, biology, things like that. That's been around since 2015. medRxiv, which is more clinical medicine, clinical trials, things like that, that's only been around about a year. So when you look at the last, not pandemic, but outbreak in terms of Ebola, back in 2014, 2015, we didn't have these sort of life science clinically focused preprint servers, so people weren't rushing to publish on them, obviously, or post on them. Now we have that, and these are again being treated like the final word, like a sort of book, something really rigorous, which a lot of the papers on there aren't. And so we do have this swirl, this kind of everybody's rushing, and again, rushing isn't so bad in and of itself. It's when you forget that rushing means you're probably going to make mistakes, and that nothing you're looking at is the final word. That's when we start to get into trouble, and mass good, mass bad. You add in the politics of all that, and it's a perfect storm. It's in some ways it's sort of a dumpster fire of science communication.
Okay. So I want to ask you about, AstraZeneca and Moderna, they both said that they were going to come up with treatments, and they haven't published their data. But it makes the stock market go up, when these things happen. And so how should we be reacting to it? I mean, everyone wants to be hopeful. So.
Yeah, everyone wants to be hopeful. Everyone, should be hopeful, but let's not forget the problem with false hope, right? That can be just as dangerous and just as risky as, as false information, frankly. And so, Moderna, and again, a lot of these are publicly traded companies, and that's one of the things that I think sometimes, I don't know if people forget, but they don't sort of think about what that means in terms of the equation. These companies are actually obligated to, put out information that could be what's called, material information. In other words, it could move the stock market. In fact, if they withhold that, it isn't so much the FDA or someone on the health side of regulation that would be coming after them. It would be the SEC. And frankly, sometimes they worry more about the SEC than they do about the FDA, right? Security and Exchange Commission. So it's kind of important to think about the purpose of some of that information. It's kind of like thinking about preprints. Again, it's fine that scientists are talking to each other. They should talk to each other more. And that's one of the good things that's happening during this pandemic, is that scientists are really starting to collaborate more. But the fact that a company puts out a press release that, as you point out, doesn't even actually have any data in it, that doesn't mean suddenly we should all think that a vaccine's coming. It means there's something that happened that they're obligated to report. Now, I'm not saying that they aren't hoping that their stock price goes up. I mean, I guess everybody hopes that their own stock price goes up. So they have motivations and conflicts of interest. But we have to be really careful about, how good is this information, and is it really very useful? When you're talking about, a sort of phase 1 trial of 8 people, in other words, a really early stage trial of 8 people, I don't know what you learned from that, especially in the short term. So, again, we all want this to happen quickly. We want all the science to advance, but we really have to put it in perspective, because otherwise we're just going to keep, making mistakes, whether it's on reporting on it, whether it's overemphasizing a particular result. These are all, we're going to keep making the same mistakes.
Okay, I just want to point out we have a Q&A box, which right now is empty. And I don't want to ask all the questions. We always want people to, so if you have a question for Ivan, please feel free to put it in the Q&A box, and we will get to that. So in all the stories that have come about, so on Facebook, people post things, you should be taking vitamin D, you should be taking zinc, take vitamin C. I mean, and some people start, and they start, I don't think these are actually fake stories being planted by Russians or anything like that. I just think people are adding all these things. People get very excited. They post something that, a new antibody test is coming out, so people are sharing information, and it's not always true. It's not always accurate. And if you start to question it, you get into fights with people. So as a journalist, so what should we be doing when we see things like this?
Well, I think social media is a great place to find what people are talking about. And sometimes what you want to do there is some sort of fact checking or some truth squatting. I mean, is there any validity to this? I mean, sometimes there is. I mean, as you point out, a lot of it there isn't. Either the studies weren't really done, or someone's uncle started a conspiracy theory, or maybe the studies were done, but they don't really say what people are claiming they do. A lot of these studies are, by their nature, observational. In other words, they're not well controlled. They weren't placebo controlled, for example. It's just that, well, maybe people with a certain, we're seeing the blood type sort of discussion happen now. And, there's studies of that. What you do with that information, I'm not quite sure. And again, it's the old correlation is not causation. It's not quite clear what you do with any of it. So I think it's actually okay and probably even a good idea to, again, do some truth squatting and say, okay, well, you may be reading about this. I mean, at Medscape, we do some of this where not so much you may be reading about it, but hey, your patients may be asking you questions about this weird thing they heard on Facebook or on Twitter or something like that. And what do here's what you should know about it. Or here's what we were able to find out about it. Here's where it came from. Here's why it probably doesn't mean what people think it means or hope it means. I think those are actually good things to do in terms of being journalists. What we don't want to do is just report it uncritically and just sort of say, well, there are a bunch of people saying it, and look, this one has 12,000 likes, so it must mean something. And again, I know you don't want to get into, and I don't either, whether the Russians are behind it or the bots or this, that, and the other. But when you start to see big numbers, you at least have to ask that question and try and wonder about, again, science is not a popularity contest. And so the fact that someone has a lot more likes or a lot more comments or whatever it is, favorites on the social media platform, it doesn't give it any more validity than you have to look at what the data are.
All right, so I'm going to ask you, what do you what makes you proud of what you've done in Medscape to educate people, and what makes you wish you could do a little better?
Yeah, I mean, so it's because Medscape is a trade publication. In other words, it's for healthcare professionals, doctors, nurses, and other healthcare workers, and all around the world. So we have editions in many, many languages, not just English, and we're not just in the U.S. We have been able to. What I've been most proud of is telling the stories of frontline healthcare workers, not necessarily even frontline healthcare workers, just healthcare workers everywhere. We had something we launched actually in early April, a memorial wall, just cataloging all of the deaths that happened, all of the healthcare workers who have died, and we add to it, actually, sadly, tragically, every day. There are well over 1,000 healthcare workers now on that memorial wall. Nick Kristof noted it a while ago in the Times in a column, and being able to, that really resonated with our readers, with our members. It's the most viewed page, I think, on the site, has been for some time now. I think we have done, really tried to tell the clinical story as these studies come out, really, again, putting in perspective, putting in context for our readers who are, again, healthcare professionals, medical professionals. So they understand that the fact that 50 doctors said, oh, here's what we saw, or, a couple doctors say, here's what we saw in a sort of case series in an ICU or something like that. They understand that doesn't mean that it's sort of a proven fact. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily something they should change their behavior based on or their clinical decision making, but that it may be something to at least wonder about, to at least know about and inform their own decision making as they're seeing a disease that no one has treated before, that no one's ever dealt with before. I think we can always, do better to tell the sort of stories of what has happened because of, the lockdowns. I mean, we've tried very hard to talk about what has happened to clinical practices because they've had to close or change or not do elective procedures. I think, we could all always do an even better job and look at, what the impact of that is. But I've been really, really proud of our team, our coverage, and, we added weekends. We have, alerts going out all the time about what's happening. And have also, again, allowed doctors and nurses and others to tell their stories. That's been, if anything, some of the richest content, along with the news and other clinical perspectives that's been happening. Just people, breaking down in videos and talking about what they're experiencing. It's very powerful and again, in many ways tragic, but it's the real stories that are happening out there. It's not just some sort of glossy version that you might see if you didn't really scratch below the surface.
I think it's also a very, as a journalist writing about this, it's it's more than a health story because there's, like the economics, the psychological aspects, lockdown, different states are doing different things. You have, governors doing press conferences, like Governor Cuomo actually came back today and with two other governors and saying they all agreed to have people from the southern states have a quarantine coming to New York. And so there's a lot of things. So there are a lot of journalists covering this story who are not, healthcare journalists, don't have a background in this. And I know that, like in CNN, they, Anderson Cooper has Sanjay Cooper's on all the time and answering questions. But the anchors are also leading they're talking about the number of cases and all these things. And do you worry about that? That there are journalists who are covering things that they're not, it's not their fields?
I mean, I don't know about worry. I think we need to be sort of aware of that. And, so AHCJ, where I'm the president right now, the Association of Healthcare Journalists, we anticipated that. And we have created something where if you're not typically a healthcare reporter, you can join for, 6 months for a sort of much reduced rate, just to get access to all of our resources, many of which we're making freely available anyway, to any reporter, to anyone. Because it's a bit like, I wrote a piece for Columbia Journalism Review that ran at the beginning of May. Sorry, that's our dog. I think she hears something in the woods. I wrote a piece in Columbia Journalism Review that ran in early May that was sort of thinking about what it would be like if the shoe were on the other foot. Like, what if I were suddenly I've covered, I trained as a doctor. I've covered medicine and science for 20 years full time, more than that now. What if I were dropped in the State House, in Boston, or City Hall in New York? I wouldn't know what I was doing. I mean, I have some vague notion of what I was doing, I like to think, because I've kept up with things, but I wouldn't know what I was doing. So it's kind of like if that State House reporter, City Hall reporter suddenly was covering science or health or medicine. That's exactly what's happening. And so these are folks who, they're smart, they're good reporters, they know how to ask tough questions, but they don't necessarily have the vocabulary. And so I think that what I tried to do in that piece was give some high level, like here, I don't know if it was 10 or 12 questions that I asked about each study. Like what sorts of, how big was the study? Was it in human beings? Was it published? Where was it published? We talked about preprint servers earlier today. Questions like that. Who dropped out of the study if it was, a clinical trial? And I think you can arm yourself. I mean, none of us were born knowing anything, really, right? I mean, you always learn on the job, in school, on the job.
Yeah.
And so I think you want to anticipate that. But if it's CNN or any other network that has, really good health staff, in other words, a health unit or a medical unit of some kind, a science unit, and I know those are declining, unfortunately, as long as they're tapping them and they're making sure that those producers are, helping out or offering advice or writing scripts or doing some of the production, of course, then I think we'll be okay. Because at the end of the day, journalism is about asking tough questions. It's not really about being an expert in anything, although it certainly helps. And that's why I have focused on the thing that I seem to know the most about my whole career.
Well, I'm a member of AHCJ and I find it very helpful. They have a lot of resources. You also can get access to journals. So that's very helpful too. So we have some questions now, which is great. So
Great, great.
How many retractions occur in the free access, non-peer reviewed journals compared to retractions in the peer reviewed journals?
No, it's a good question, although I'm going to maybe unpack a little bit. I think there may be a couple of maybe some confusion around, open access versus peer reviewed. There are plenty of open access journals, in other words, that are freely available to anyone to read, that are peer reviewed. In fact, if it's an open access journal, it's almost by definition peer reviewed. Preprint servers are something different. Again, those are open access, but they're not peer reviewed. Important distinction. If you look at the COVID-19 retractions, so there have been, we've been keeping track on Retraction Watch of the COVID-19 retractions, and we may not have caught them all. I mean, they're happening pretty quickly and in various corners, but there have been 22 retractions of COVID-19 papers so far. And I don't have it in front of me, but if memory serves, I think 9 of them were in preprint servers. So that would leave, more than half of them in traditional, peer-reviewed journals, including, as we mentioned earlier, the Lancet and New England Journal of Medicine, 2 top journals. We hadn't typically looked at preprint servers for retraction because there just weren't very many of them. The whole point of a preprint server is you update the paper. So it's a little bit, we just don't know what's happening yet. Overall, there are close to 22,000 retractions ever. This is obviously not about COVID. This is just about everything since, well, the very earliest retraction was in 1756, at least the earliest English language retraction. It involved someone who was trying to claim that Ben Franklin had gotten something wrong. It turns out Ben Franklin was right. But really retractions didn't really start happening until the 1970s. And then they really ramped up. Now they're about 1,500 per year. People often ask us whether there are more retractions or fewer retractions in open access journals. Again, really not sure, because journals aren't, unless you know that the journal is open access, I mean, +1 or something like that, sorry, she's likely to do that for a little while, as long as you can hear me. They don't, typically label themselves that way, sort of in the metadata that we would capture. But the problem with looking at retraction rates is just because a journal or in a field or even a person has more retractions, all that really tells you is that more people were paying attention. In other words, more people were reading it. So it would stand to reason that open access journals would have more retractions. It's a complicated, set of confounding variables, frankly, but people are looking at that. We offer our database to anyone who wants to, take a look at that and study it. Happy to talk further about that.
Here's a question. Scientists finally had their 15 minutes at the onset of COVID-19, but interest has waned given lockdown fatigue and other factors. Why didn't scientific trade groups capitalize on the moment in the spotlight to raise awareness, attention, funding, promote STEM, etc.? And is it too late to do so? That's a tough question, but.
Well, I mean, part of it I'm gonna punt on because I don't read minds. I ask people all the time why they did something or didn't do something as a reporter, but I can't. I have no idea why they did or didn't do what they did. This is a bit speculative, but I mean they were all pretty busy, and so trying to do your work as a scientist, or as an advocate, while being in the midst of a pandemic and while probably having to handle issues, maybe if you have children and they're at home, that's not going to be too conducive to being all that productive. I mean, I think it's amazing people have been as productive as they have been, frankly. I mean, labs are shut in many cases. People are managing to do different kinds of work. I don't know. I mean, I'm probably not the best person to ask in terms of whether it's too late or whether promoting STEM is good, bad, or otherwise. I will say, you've seen Twitter, for example, and again, social media can be good, bad, and otherwise. You've seen Twitter really ramp up in terms of the blue checks. In other words, the what do you call it? Verification checks. So a lot more doctors, epidemiologists have those now, and they're attracting a lot of followers. So I actually do think there's some things that are happening. Again, that's not the be all and end all, but I mean, the New York Times has always liked, I mean, whatever's happened with their op-ed page recently, leave that aside for a second. They've always liked, clinical op-eds from doctors, from nurses, et cetera, and some scientific ones, but that they're all over the place now. I mean, that's a lot of the people who are contributing. So again, I don't like to make predictions, and I certainly don't like to read people's minds, but I think it's entirely possible that you will see a little bit of I don't know, a sort of, is it a Sputnik moment maybe? I mean, I'm not a historian of science, but I think it's at least worth paying attention to.
Well, when they say this is a novel virus, it's also a novel for coverage by we've had pandemics in the past, but we didn't have cable TV, we didn't have a lot of
Sure.
things.
Yep.
So, how do you handle the intersection of the clinical and the political story of the U.S. response to COVID? I ask this in light of the EU's likely decision to block U.S. tourism to member countries because of our country's failure to control the virus.
Well, I mean, part of the way I always think about every story is that every story is political. I mean, everything is political. I know that sounds glib, but it's also true. I mean, hydroxychloroquine is a great example of a story that has been super politicized. Again, it never wasn't political, but when you have a really not high quality, that's being very kind, I would say poor study that grabbed headlines in France, and that the researchers behind really pushed and continue to push, that grabbed the media's attention, and then it was off to the races. And it's hard to get the horse back in the barn if that happens. And so then that turned into a political story there, and now it's a political story, of course. It has been now for some time in the U.S. And we have President Trump, making all sorts of evidence-free statements about hydroxychloroquine. In terms of the ban, again, I don't know enough about the politics of that ban, or about what's likely to happen. We banned people from other countries for a while, and so I guess that's just how it all goes. But to me, the question as a medical reporter, as any kind of reporter, is always, what is the evidence behind this? Sure, it may have political tinge or be hyper politicized, but what's the evidence behind these decisions that given governments are making? And I think that if you always come back to that, it's not that you're going to sway people, but you're going to hopefully inform people who want to be informed, and that's to me where you start. I mean, is there any evidence that these bans would work, or if they won't, why are we doing them? Kind of questions.
Okay, so here's a question. When we started off, talking about the topic was, are we eroding? Like the CDC and the World Health Organization have been attacked. Like I've never seen them attacked. I always thought, okay, they're great, they're fun, they're good organizations, and they've always been useful sources of information. And they've been really attacked, not only in the United States, but worldwide, especially the World Health Organization. And journalists have been attacked for giving information, and by politicians from all over the world. And I don't want to talk about the enemy of the people, but journalists have been attacked for telling the story, scaring people. There are politicians like Governor Cuomo who's been attacked for, yes, he's doing good, but no, he shouldn't have moved people into nursing homes. And I saw Mayor de Blasio that what about the $2 billion you've stolen, and why are you giving it back, and respirators. And so has this pandemic really made people cynical about established things like the World Health Organization or the CDC, or scientists in general, who because the information changes? I mean, don't wear a mask, wear a mask.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, and again, I'm not I don't survey people. I don't know attitudes all that well. I mean, Pew Charitable Trust obviously does that.
Right.
Others, Harris polls, and you won't see those polls for some time. You want to sort of let whatever effect happen, or see what effects happened after some time. I will say though, shooting the messenger is a, I don't know, centuries old tradition. And sort of criticizing politicians is a probably even longer tradition than that, and frankly should be. I mean, I think we should all be, appropriately critical of decisions, especially of powerful people. It's journalism is afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. I think that, and enemy of the people is, well, that's much older. That's, you've got, Nixon used that. I mean, so there's, is that when trust in government declined? I don't know. I mean, yes, the CDC has been clearly sidelined. I think Helen Branswell has done some really excellent work on that. There's a group at the Times that had a story just a week or two ago, and I know Apoorva Mandavili, who recently joined the Times, was part of that reporting effort. So clearly that's happened. The WHO has always been a political football, certainly here in the States, but also, around the world in different ways. They're in a tough spot, right? Because, their argument, well, I don't want to put words in their mouth, but one of the arguments I hear is, if you want to work with every country in the world, or at least as many of them as possible, not every country gets along, and obviously some get along even worse than others. So I think maybe and I don't know if this is new either, and maybe it doesn't feel new to me because of the kind of work that I've done for, at least 10 years with Retraction Watch. People are always trying to undermine the media when they tell stories that are, as Al Gore put it, inconvenient truths. I see that as part of doing business as a reporter. I see that as part of truth telling as a reporter. And again, if they're bad faith actors, they're bad faith actors. They're always going to be those people. But many politicians are in that category. But I think that, it does come with the territory. And maybe if science reporters, medical reporters who aren't used to that are suddenly getting a little bit of a taste of that. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Again, if it's contextualized and if it doesn't put anyone in danger, at risk, that's never what I want to see happen, and have avoided so far at Retraction Watch. So I think maybe we need to, I don't know if it's a new normal or if it's just the normal that's always been there that is suddenly in our sphere in ways that maybe science and health reporters haven't seen before. But, be prepared. That's going to happen. If you spend your whole career as a journalist and you never get an angry letter, or, you only get a rare angry letter, I don't want to be unkind here, but I wonder, are you asking tough enough questions, and are you holding people accountable, the way you really want to be? And maybe there's more of that happening now, and that's a good thing. But it does mean that there are going to be more angry people.
I was once told a story I was writing was going to end in hundreds of thousands of lives. It's about salt. And I said, okay, whatever. All right, so here's a question. Are there simple messages reporters should include in stories about possible treatments / vaccines to convey the complexity of the process of science that could help manage expectations?
I actually do think there are. It's a great question, and I'll tell you what they are, but I also think that we need to look inward a little bit and take some responsibility for decades of, the way we report on things. And I'll get to what I mean on that in a second. Adam Marcus, who's my co-founder of Retraction Watch, and I fairly early, at least in the U.S., sort of, events of the pandemic, I think it was in late March, Adam and I wrote a piece for Wired where we talked about the speed of the science and how quickly things were moving. And we ended it with a suggestion, and it was only about 10% tongue in cheek, that everything needs a label right now. Everything needs a label that says what you're reading is preliminary. This is about preliminary research, it's preliminary finding that more than likely will turn out to be at least partially wrong. And I think when scientists are being honest, they would agree with that, is that everything is preliminary. Knowledge is provisional and everything's preliminary. But getting to where I think we kind of have created issues for ourselves over time as science and health reporters, we created that expectation that every study was important and that, everything was life-changing or in the case of trade journals and practice changing, when we sort of signed up, to report on a particular study every week from whatever one of the big journals was. And we, some of you may know some of my other work. I have been sort of railing against embargoes for a long time. And I think that some of the things that go with embargoes have ceded control of the timing and frankly the subject matter, the content of what we cover to journals and to institutions, and there are worse, powers that be to cede control of those things to. But what that means is that we overemphasize what are really minor studies. We overemphasize sort of the events of publication as opposed to what actually happens in science, which is a process, which is sort of maybe one step forward, two steps back sometimes, then two steps forward, one step back, etc. And so I think that we've done ourselves and readers and viewers and listeners a disservice by not creating that sense of context before. So if this wakes us up and sort of says, hey, let's do better next time, great. But I don't think this problem wasn't created by COVID. It's been around for some time.
So, like you, I get embargoed, articles all the time, and I see that stories I think are very interesting. They're not being covered because everything's on COVID-19. Are you worried that we're missing have we missed any major story? That's not, I mean,
maybe, but they'll exist. There's nothing saying that we can only cover a story the minute it comes out. I mean, that's part of the sort of myth of embargoes. Excuse me. Those studies will have come out, and frankly, even would we miss something? Well, the study you're reading about, even with the sped up process that we have now, and not just for COVID, but other research, that study isn't new anyway. It took however long to do, and then it took a while to put the paper together, and then it took a while to get submitted and then rejected from 8 journals or whatever, and then it finally got published. So you're really reading, it's like a time machine, or it's like looking up at the sky at night and oh, look, there's a planet, except that planet is somewhere else, not somewhere else by then, but the that's not what it looked like at this moment, because speed of light, even as fast as it is, it takes a while and all that. So you're looking again, sort of a time machine, a time capsule. Time machine was the wrong phrase. It's more of a time capsule. So I think it's fine. Like, let's find that research, and you know what? Let's find out what's happened since then that either validated it or proved it maybe not quite right or not entirely correct. I mean, that's a real opportunity. There was a cool little experiment. Excuse me, a sort of field experiment that happened. The paper wasn't published. I think it was 1991, but his name is David Phillips. I want to say it's David Phillips. He was a sociologist, and he looked at what happened when the New York Times, because there was a strike, a driver's strike. Was it a driver's strike or a press strike? Press worker strike, I don't remember. But in any case, they didn't publish the paper, but they created one. So they actually had this natural experiment of, well, these are the stories that a reporter chose, that editors chose to actually run in a paper, but nobody saw it. So is there any impact? A tree fell in the forest and nobody saw it. And it turns out, and there have been a couple studies like that, and this is not pre-embargo, but when everyone was using embargoes. It was in the 70s. It turns out that journalists aren't that good at picking out what's important anyway. Again, there's some not controversy over that, but there's at least some compelling data on both sides of that. But that's one read of that. So I'm not that worried about missing things. I'm far more worried about overemphasizing findings that turn out not to be that important.
Okay. Another question. Any suggestions for what to do when a government official lies to a reporter about a medical or science matter?
Yeah, call them to account. And I think, again, even in the sort of not very funny comedy routine that White House briefings have become, you have reporters standing up and actually pushing back and questioning. I will say that doesn't necessarily solve the problem of people who were going to believe anything that, the president said or that one of his sort of spokespeople said. There's other issues with that. Thankfully, the notion people had for a little while of the backfire effect, where if you questioned it and if you sort of demonstrated why it was incorrect, it would actually cause people to just double down and believe it more. That turns out to probably not be as big a problem as we thought. In fact, it may not be a problem really that we have to worry about, although, again, more research is needed, as scientists always say. I would push back on it. I mean, I would, again, there was a lot of debate, not so much around COVID, but, in the early days of the Trump administration, where, and news organizations sort of, they tiptoed to the line and then they sort of ran over the line in many cases. But do you call something a falsehood? Do you start out by saying, well, President Trump claimed without evidence? That's sort of basically saying he's lying, but it doesn't impute any, it doesn't sort of give you any sense of intent, right? It could be that he just didn't know, which, again, we're not going to discuss tonight. But then at some point they started to call them lies. I think we have to tell the truth. I think we have to question claims. And this is what, science and health journalists should always be doing. Sorry, it's not COVID. I think I swallowed a bug by accident. Right. But, we set ourselves up for this false dichotomy or this sort of false binarity, that's not a word, but a false binary perspective on the world. If we say that, well, it came out in a study, so it must be right. We should be asking questions about all those. And some of the best reporting is when reporters ask tough questions about studies. And this, again, pre-COVID, and actually try to find out things that aren't true or find out things that aren't supported. So we should be holding scientists accountable as well as politicians. Right now, the politicians are a bit more of an issue.
So here's a question. Are you concerned that the retractions and occasional missteps that are occurring in the scientific community in connection with COVID-19 will be used to discredit scientific studies that support the human causes of global warming?
I understand the question, and actually we get it a lot. And there's a sort of concern, if you will, that, sort of the work we do or the work that a lot of people do, pointing out what happens when science goes wrong or what mistakes people make, can be what's called weaponized. In other words, sort of used against science. And maybe it's not COVID research this time. Next time they use to discredit, again, research on global warming or on vaccines or anything else. It's certainly a risk. People have talked about that and pointed that out. But I think that maybe, and I don't mean the question is short-sighted, but I think that overvaluing that concern, sort of worrying about that concern, when forgetting that the real way that you lose trust is when you try and cover up that something's happening, right? Again, going back to Nixon, I can't believe I've referred to Richard Nixon twice tonight, but, it's not, what we learned there is not the crime, it's the cover up. And so if scientists, continue to insist, and many of them have stopped doing this, thankfully, that, misconduct doesn't happen, errors don't happen, sort of everything's great, everything's perfect, you should trust us all the time. And then bad things do happen. And if it turns out that scientists weren't forthright about talking about them, then that's when you lose trust. And that's well documented. And so the bigger concern for me is when we don't talk about these issues and we normalize, sort of this idea that, I think it's better, in fact, to normalize the idea that mistakes happen, and that's part of the scientific process. And look at this, there are retractions because scientists are actually willing to correct themselves, unlike politicians. So I think you have to think about maybe it's a longer game, or I don't know what the metaphor is, but the problem is, again, not so much that they're happening and that people are going to use that against you. People who are going to use something against you are always going to find something to use against you. That's what they do. They're doing oppo research all the time. And maybe it's intellectually honest, and a lot of the time it's not. So the real question is, tell the real story so that the next time someone makes a mistake and fesses up, you remember the last time somebody fessed up and it all went much better, as opposed to, oh, we can't talk about that. I mean, that to me, that's not, again, that's not journalism. It's sort of, it's like, not writing about allegations about the candidate that you like, or that you think is the better candidate for an office. That's not going to, and that's not going to encourage trust. It's actually going to blow your trust when it turns out that you covered that up or you didn't write about it, when you're so willing to write about the opposition candidate. So we just, we need to sort of tell the truth. We need to report on facts, and some of them are going to be inconvenient.
So, so just a question about, how you practice. So a lot of newsrooms are, people are reporting from their homes. CBS for a while was in Stephen Colbert's headquarters. A lot of journalists are, reporting from their homes. I guess you're reporting from your home. Has that made journalism more difficult, not having, meetings with, people and not seeing people in real time, or you think it doesn't really matter?
Oh, I think it's definitely made things more difficult. I mean, I'm always a big fan of the, in-person interview. You can do a lot of that by phone or by, Zoom or something like that. I think that, so there's a lot of challenges there. You don't develop as good relationships as you might if you aren't sort of seeing people. Frankly, even at a very brass tacks level, it's going to be harder for someone to leak you something confidential. I mean, yes, of course, there's, all sorts of encryption and all of that, but, not every whistleblower, and for good reason, is going to trust all of that. So I think in that kind of work, it could make things much more difficult. On the other hand, it also means that everyone can sort of talk more freely, or more frequently, I should say, because of technology, and people are embracing technology and doing so much more with it. So I guess it's probably like everything else, a double-edged sword, but I do think that there is something about being able to gather. Conferences are a great source of, maybe not all the breaking news there is as big breaking news as the conference organizers like us to think, at some of these clinical meetings. But, it's a good place to meet sources and talk to people. So I think that, again, on balance, who knows? I haven't done a calculation, but I think that clearly there's some negatives and positives of having to work at home and not being able to meet people in real time.
I was looking forward to going to Austin for the annual conference. That didn't
Yeah,
happen.
no, I mean, speaking of conferences, I was thinking that as I was talking about conferences, HCJ, our meeting was scheduled for beginning of May, and obviously, and I'm board president, so I had a fair amount to do with thinking through it and working with the board and with our executive director on that decision. But we've moved it. It's going to be next year at this point. We're still finalizing some things, but no, it's difficult. On the other hand, we've been able to have weekly webinars on COVID and bring in some really terrific speakers who might not have all been able to make it to, never mind COVID, just people are busy and committing the time to go to Austin, which I was really looking forward to. It's difficult. So again, it's a balance.
Okay. Yeah, the National Association of Science Writers Conference is not taking place. I'm supposed to go to Lindau Nobel Laureates Week. Everything that I was supposed to go to has been canceled. So, we'll see. Although baseball is starting. Anyway.
Baseball is starting, although it's empty. I have season tickets to the Yankees and the bleachers with a friend of mine. And it's actually, I mean, I like getting checks every month because, they have to refund us, but it's kind of a sad thing to get a check every month from the New York Yankees.
I was supposed to go to Wimbledon.
Yeah.
Anyway, all right. So I want to thank my guest, Ivan Oransky, Vice President, Editorial of Medscape. I also really want to thank, who I've not thanked yet, Joe Bonner, who's my co-chair and makes all these Zoom talks possible and posting them on the website and, figuring out who we're going to interview. So on June 30th, I'm doing a book interview with Maria Konnikova, who has a new book about her year spent playing poker, where she earned $300,000. She was the author of How to Think Like Sherlock Holmes, and I actually interviewed her in person, which I missed doing, on The Confidence Game. So her book was just published yesterday, it's called The Biggest Bluff, and it was got rave reviews, and so hopefully you'll tune in on that too. So Ivan, thank you for your time, and I appreciate it, and you're making me jealous of this beautiful background that you have there.
Oh, when it's all over, David, you'll have to come up. But thank you. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks, Joe, for setting this all up and getting it all done. So appreciate it, and look forward to talking to you soon.
And we're going to post this on YouTube for people who tuned in later, for people who couldn't make it tonight. So thanks again.
Be well.